Right now, somewhere out there, a piece of ancient cave art, a carved symbol, or a mysterious arrangement of stones sits quietly waiting for someone to properly interpret it. It's tempting to imagine these as deliberate messages. Ancient humans reaching directly across tens of thousands of years specifically to communicate something to us, their distant future descendants. But is that actually what's happening? Did ancient humans actually intend to leave messages for people living this far into the future? Or is this a case of modern audiences reading intention and communication into markings that actually served a completely different, more immediate purpose for the people who originally created them? Let's dig into this properly, because the honest answer requires carefully separating a few meaningfully distinct questions, and it turns out to be a lot more nuanced than a simple yes or no. Let's start by drawing an important distinction worth establishing clearly up front because it shapes how to think about this entire topic properly. There's a meaningful difference between ancient humans creating something specifically intended to communicate with distant future generations they could never possibly meet or know, versus ancient humans creating something intended to communicate with their own contemporaries or perhaps their immediate descendants within a few generations that simply happened to survive and eventually reach us, tens of thousands of years later, as an unintended byproduct of its original, considerably more immediate purpose. These represent meaningfully different scenarios, and conflating them risks fundamentally misunderstanding what a lot of ancient markings and artifacts actually represented to the people who originally created them. Let's talk about cave art specifically first, since it represents probably the most commonly discussed example within this broader topic. Extensive cave art discovered across various sites in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, some dating back tens of thousands of years, shows sophisticated, often strikingly skilled depictions of animals, human figures, and various abstract symbols and patterns. Researchers studying this art generally believe it served a range of different purposes for the specific communities that created it, including possible religious or spiritual significance, practical instructional purposes related to hunting, and various forms of social or cultural expression relevant to that specific community's own immediate needs and interests. There's little direct evidence suggesting this art was specifically created with the deliberate, conscious intention of communicating across tens of thousands of years to some distant, unimaginable future audience the original artists could never have realistically conceived of or anticipated. This doesn't mean the art wasn't meaningful or intentional. It clearly was, reflecting real skill, real cultural significance, and real communicative intent directed toward the artist's own immediate community and context. But intentional and meaningful to its original creators is a meaningfully different claim from specifically intended as a deliberate message for people living tens of thousands of years in the future. And conflating these two distinct claims risks projecting a considerably more deliberate, future-oriented intention onto ancient art than the actual evidence and context actually supports. Let's talk about specific symbols and markings that some researchers have proposed might represent something closer to genuine written communication, though still not necessarily aimed at distant future audiences specifically, because this represents an important, more nuanced middle category worth exploring directly. Various ancient sites show repeated, consistent symbolic markings that some researchers have proposed might represent an early proto-written system of communication, potentially encoding practical information like seasonal timing, lunar cycles, or other information relevant to the specific community using these markings in their own daily life and activities. If this interpretation holds up under continued scholarly scrutiny, it would represent a genuine, if considerably more modest, functional form of ancient communication, intended for practical use by the artist's own community and likely their more immediate descendants, rather than specifically directed toward any distant, unknowable future audience. Let's talk about actual written language and its relationship to this broader question too, because once humans developed formal writing systems, the picture shifts somewhat, though perhaps not quite as dramatically as you might initially assume. The earliest confirmed writing systems, developing independently in various regions including ancient Mesopotamia and separately in ancient China, were overwhelmingly practical in their original purpose. Tracking trade transactions, recording tax obligations, documenting legal agreements, and various other immediate, practical administrative functions relevant to the specific society that developed and used that particular writing system. Early writing served primarily to solve immediate, practical communication and record-keeping problems facing that specific society during its own particular historical moment, rather than functioning as a tool for communicating with distant future generations. This detail is worth sitting with because it means even actual, confirmed written language, something considerably closer to genuine deliberate communication compared to cave art or ambiguous symbolic markings, still wasn't primarily created with future audiences specifically in mind during its earliest development and most common everyday use. The fact that some of these early written records happened to survive long enough for modern researchers to eventually discover and translate them represents a kind of fortunate historical accident, rather than reflecting the original writer's specific, deliberate intention to communicate directly with people living thousands of years after their own lifetime. Now let's talk about the genuine exceptions worth exploring specifically, because there are some documented cases where ancient humans really did appear to create something with at least some degree of conscious awareness that it might be encountered by people considerably later than their own immediate lifetime, even if not necessarily specifically calculated for audiences as distant as us today. Various ancient monuments, inscriptions, and burial practices show evidence of deliberate effort toward durability and permanence that suggests at least some degree of awareness that this particular creation might be encountered by people well beyond the creator's own immediate lifetime, even if the creators weren't necessarily imagining an audience specifically as distant and culturally different as modern people today. Let's talk about ancient monumental inscriptions specifically, because certain examples provide particularly compelling evidence relevant to this specific, more nuanced category. Various ancient rulers across different civilizations commissioned inscriptions specifically intended to commemorate their achievements for posterity, explicitly framed in some surviving cases in language that directly addresses future readers or expresses an explicit hope that the specific achievements being recorded would be remembered by later generations. This represents a meaningfully different category of intention compared to either the purely practical administrative writing already discussed or the likely community-focused purpose of most cave art, reflecting at least some genuine conscious awareness and deliberate intention regarding future audiences, even if those ancient rulers were almost certainly imagining a future audience considerably closer in time and culture to their own, rather than specifically anticipating an audience as distant and culturally transformed as modern researchers examining their inscriptions many thousands of years later. Let's talk about burial practices, engraved goods too, because this represents another category worth considering specifically in relation to this broader question. Elaborate ancient burials, discussed at greater length in other explorations of how ancient societies approached death and the afterlife, sometimes included items and practices seemingly intended to convey information or provide resources for the deceased individual's journey into whatever afterlife that particular culture's belief system anticipated. While this reflects genuine intentionality and meaning, it's generally understood as being directed towards the deceased individual themselves, or towards spiritual and religious entities according to that specific culture's particular belief system, rather than representing a deliberate message specifically intended for later human researchers or any kind of distant future human audience discovering the burial site long after the fact. Let's talk about time capsules and deliberately constructed messages intended for future audiences too, because this represents a meaningfully distinct, considerably more recent phenomenon worth mentioning, specifically as an important point of contrast. The deliberate creation of messages, artifacts, or capsules, specifically and explicitly intended for future discovery, sometimes even including detailed instructions or explanations meant to help a future audience understand the specific historical context and intended meaning, represents a considerably more recent human practice, becoming particularly well documented and increasingly common from the more recent past, closely tied to a more explicitly developed conceptual understanding of deep historical time and generational continuity across many centuries or even millennia into the future. This detail is worth including because it highlights an important, genuine contrast worth appreciating directly. Deliberately, explicitly intending to communicate specifically with an unknown future audience, potentially many thousands of years removed from your own specific historical and cultural context, requires a fairly sophisticated, deliberately cultivated conceptual framework regarding deep historical time that doesn't appear to have been a significant, common feature of most ancient human thought and cultural practice, at least not in anything resembling the deliberate, explicit way modern time capsules and similar practices specifically embody and pursue. By the way, If you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about a particularly striking modern example worth exploring specifically, because it offers a seriously useful contrast that helps clarify exactly what deliberate future-oriented communication actually looks like when humans consciously set out to create it. The Voyager Golden Records, launched into space in the late 1970s attached to the Voyager space probes, represent an explicit, deliberately engineered attempt to communicate specific information about human civilization to any potential future audience, whether that audience turns out to be far future humans or, more provocatively, some kind of non-human intelligence encountering the probe at some unknown point potentially millions of years in the future. This project involved careful, deliberate consideration of exactly how to encode meaningful information in a way that might remain interpretable across an almost unimaginably long span of time, and potentially across a complete absence of any shared cultural or even biological context whatsoever, with whoever or whatever might eventually encounter it. This example is worth including specifically because it throws the ancient examples already discussed into sharp relief. The deliberate, careful, explicit effort involved in a project like the Voyager Golden Records, anticipating and actively planning for an audience so distant and so potentially unfamiliar that basic assumptions about shared language or even shared biology couldn't be taken for granted, represents a fundamentally different category of intention compared to virtually anything found in the ancient archaeological and historical record already discussed throughout this topic. It highlights just how unusual and cognitively demanding this kind of truly deep future-oriented communication actually is, and how rarely, if ever, ancient human societies appear to have attempted anything closely comparable in scope or deliberate intention. Let's talk about a related, remarkably fascinating modern parallel worth mentioning too, involving the practical challenge of creating warning markers for nuclear waste storage sites intended to remain comprehensible for tens of thousands of years into the future, potentially long after any currently existing human language, culture, or even shared symbolic system might still be recognizable or meaningful to whoever eventually encounters these specific sites. Researchers and policy specialists working on this specific modern challenge have had to seriously grapple with exactly the same fundamental problem ancient humans apparently never systematically attempted to solve. How do you reliably communicate a specific, critical piece of information across a time frame so vast that literally everything about human language, culture, and even our current systems of symbolic representation might have changed beyond all recognition by the time that message actually needs to be understood and heeded? This modern challenge has proven remarkably difficult to solve satisfactorily, with proposed solutions ranging from deliberately unsettling architectural designs intended to convey danger through pure emotional and instinctive response, rather than relying on any specific written language, to elaborate proposed systems involving specially trained future generations of message keepers tasked with actively maintaining and passing down the relevant warning information across many successive generations. The sheer difficulty modern experts have had grappling with this specific challenge helps illustrate, by direct comparison, just how seriously rare and difficult deliberate, effective deep-time future communication actually is, reinforcing the broader point that ancient humans likely weren't routinely attempting anything closely comparable, since even modern experts equipped with sophisticated linguistic and anthropological knowledge still find this specific kind of deep future communication extraordinarily difficult to reliably achieve. Let's talk about the Rosetta Stone, and similar decoding breakthroughs too, because they offer an interesting related angle worth exploring specifically, illustrating how modern researchers actually managed to interpret truly ancient written communication despite these ancient texts never having been specifically intended for a modern audience at all. The Rosetta Stone, containing the same decree inscribed in 3 different ancient scripts, provided researchers with the critical key needed to finally decode ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics after centuries of failed attempts. allowing modern scholars to eventually read and understand an enormous body of ancient Egyptian writing that had previously been completely inaccessible and mysterious. It's worth being clear that the original decree itself was created purely for immediate, practical, administrative, and political purposes relevant to ancient Egyptian society at that specific historical moment. The fact that it eventually became the crucial key unlocking modern understanding of an entire ancient civilization's writing system represents an extraordinary historical accident and coincidence, rather than anything resembling deliberate intention on the part of the original ancient scribes who created it for entirely different, immediate reasons specific to their own historical moment. This detail reinforces an important theme worth carrying through the rest of this discussion. Some of the most historically significant instances of ancient communication successfully reaching and informing modern audiences happened entirely by chance, through fortunate accidents of preservation and discovery, rather than through any deliberate ancient intention to specifically communicate with people living thousands of years in the future. The value modern researchers eventually extracted from these ancient texts was real and considerable, but it emerged from careful modern interpretation applied to material created for entirely different, immediate original purposes, rather than reflecting any conscious ancient effort specifically directed toward eventually informing a distant future audience. Let's talk about how this whole topic connects to human psychology and our own natural interpretive tendencies too, because there's a seriously interesting cognitive dimension worth exploring before wrapping up. Humans appear to have a strong, natural tendency toward finding intentional meaning and communication in patterns, even when a considerably more mundane, non-communicative explanation might actually be more accurate. A well-documented psychological tendency sometimes referred to as apophenia in more extreme or unusual cases. This natural human tendency toward finding intentional meaning likely plays a meaningful role in why modern audiences sometimes readily interpret ancient art and artifacts as deliberate messages specifically intended for us, even when the more careful, contextually grounded archaeological interpretation suggests a considerably more mundane, immediate, community-focused original purpose instead. Let's talk about how modern researchers and archaeologists actually approach interpreting ancient artifacts and markings too, because this connects to an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers generally try to interpret ancient artifacts and markings within their most plausible original cultural and historical context, considering what purpose that particular item most likely served for the people who actually created and used it during their own lifetime, rather than immediately assuming any kind of deliberate, forward-looking communicative intention specifically directed toward future audiences. This careful, context-focused interpretive approach helps guard against the natural human tendency to project overly deliberate, future-oriented intention onto ancient artifacts that most likely served considerably more immediate, practical, or culturally specific purposes for their original creators and their own contemporary community. Let's talk briefly about petroglyphs and boundary markers too, because they represent another interesting category worth mentioning specifically, given how frequently they get popularly discussed in exactly the kind of message for the future framing this whole topic is examining critically. Various ancient cultures created rock carvings and markers along travel routes, territorial boundaries, and significant landscape features, likely serving practical navigational, territorial, or ceremonial functions relevant to travelers and community members within a reasonably contemporary timeframe, rather than representing anything resembling a deliberate message aimed at a distant future audience specifically. Some of these markers may well have been intended to remain meaningful across multiple generations, marking an important boundary or route that a community expected to remain relevant for a considerable stretch of time. But intended to remain useful across several generations is still a meaningfully different claim from deliberately created as a message for people living tens of thousands of years later, and the archaeological evidence generally supports the more modest, generationally bounded interpretation far more consistently than the more dramatic, deep future-oriented one. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, honest answer to whether ancient humans left messages for us turns out to be considerably more nuanced than either a simple, uncomplicated yes or a simple, dismissive no. The overwhelming majority of ancient art, symbols, and even early written language was created primarily to serve immediate, practical, or culturally specific purposes relevant to the artist's or writer's own community and their own particular historical moment, rather than reflecting any deliberate, conscious intention to communicate specifically with distant future audiences separated by tens of thousands of years of subsequent human history. However, certain specific categories, particularly some monumental inscriptions explicitly commissioned with posterity and future memory in mind, do reflect genuine, conscious intention regarding at least some meaningfully distant future audience, even if that intended audience was likely imagined as considerably closer in time and cultural context compared to the actual modern researchers who eventually encountered and interpreted these specific inscriptions many centuries or millennia later than originally anticipated. So the next time you encounter a piece of striking, evocative ancient cave art, or a carefully preserved ancient inscription, it's worth appreciating it honestly for what it most likely actually represented to the specific people who originally created it. A meaningful, intentional act of communication or expression directed toward their own immediate community, their gods, or perhaps their more immediate descendants, rather than assuming it was specifically, deliberately crafted as a message meant for you, personally, reading or viewing it this many thousands of years later. The genuine intention and meaning behind these ancient creations remains real and worth respecting and understanding on its own specific terms, even without needing to imagine a deliberate, direct communicative connection stretching all the way across the entire span of human history to reach you personally, right now, in this exact moment. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If most ancient art and communication wasn't actually intended for us specifically, despite how compelling and personally meaningful it can still feel to encounter it today, what does that suggest about the powerful, very human tendency to find personal connection and direct communication in things that were never actually meant for us at all? And what does that same tendency suggest about how future humans, tens of thousands of years from now, might eventually come to interpret and find deeply personal meaning in the ordinary, unremarkable artifacts we're leaving behind completely unintentionally right now in our own ordinary daily lives?